All right, so the same idea that we used with sine is going to be how we graph cosine. And so here I've got an example, and we're just going to do a couple. Since we have the general idea already for sine, we can attack cosine a little bit faster. All right, so I want to graph y equals 4 times the cosine of x. And so when I do that, again, I'm going to be using my same input values, and I'm going to be taking whatever the general cosine output is and multiplying it times 4. So my general output for my cosine is 1, 0, -1, 0, and 1. And again, you can do this really quickly by just moving around the unit circle and just thinking about what's the x-coordinate at these radians. But now this number on the outside is going to tell me I want to stretch all of those by a factor of 4. So now my new position, or my new placement, all right, I'm going to multiply all of those original values by 4. Okay. And so again, I have to think about taking the absolute value of whatever number is right here in front of cosine, and that's going to be my amplitude. My period is still 2 pi. Right. Again, there's no number in between cosine and x in my generic. I need something there to change that. My domain is still going to go from 0 to 2 pi. And now in this case, my range, I could graph this first, or I could just look at these output values and say what's the smallest, which is -4, and the largest, which is +4. Right. And now because I don't have a plus or minus anything right here, my midline is going to stay at y equals 0. And so anytime you look at this plus d, that's what you're going to use for your midline. And so you can do it now or you can wait. Right? But now when you make your graph, again, now I have to make sure that I can go +4 and -4 on my axis, but I didn't want to make a graph that used 4 of my lines on my paper up and down. And so what I did was I used halfway in between, still labeling my x values as my radians. And so now I'm going to graph. All right, so now I'm going to start at this coordinate 0, 4, drop down to pi over 2 and 0. At pi, I'm going to jump to -4, and then I'm going to start moving my way back up again. So all we're doing is just plotting the coordinates. And again, depending on how evenly spaced this is, this will look like a nice curve, but it should be the same cosine just stretched. And you want to make it look like a curve. Right. And so this is what your function looks like for 4 times the cosine of x. The 4 in the front just stretched this graph. And what it does is it changes the height of those mins and maxes. It changes that gap from this midline to those points. Let's look at another one. Again, we've already done some similar to this. So now I'm going to say, well, what happens if I take the cosine of x and just add 4? So now I'm not messing with this right here. All I'm doing is taking my normal cosine values, which were all of these, right? And now I'm going to add 4 to all of them. All right? So those normal cosine outputs, right, I want to add 4. And that's going to change now the placement of all of my points. So now I'm actually going to be going up to 5, and then 4, and then 3, 4, and 5. And I'd already made a graph down here, but it looks like I'm going to need to extend this up just a little bit farther, so that way I can make sure I can get all of my y values on there. And again, my amplitude is the absolute value of the number sitting right here in front of cosine. And since I don't see anything, it's automatically a 1. All factors have a 1 in front when you don't see a coefficient. All right. Period is still 2 pi. And you're going to notice that I changed I started to shortcut and just use the first letter of my amplitude, period, domain, range, and midline. The worksheet that you're going to get does the same thing. Right. So from 0 to 2 pi. Right. Now my range, again, I can look at this and say the smallest y value is 3, largest y value is 5. Right. But now my midline, again, this value right here tells me my midline. My midline is always what happens, right, when I add something to my graph. So now my midline is going to shift up to y equals 4. And so you can actually put that midline on your graph first if you want to, as kind of like a key that you need to make sure that your two middle coordinates are rooted there. So you'll have a high, a root in the midline, a low, a root, and high again. And so let's just look at our graph. Again, that means I'm going to have a coordinate right here, all right, because I need a 0, 5. And then right here at pi over 2, I'm at 4. All right. At pi, I'm going to go to 3. All right. So I'm just going to plot these points again. And then I need to just, it's really going to be you just trying to do the best you can. And just take your time to make sure that you can make a nice curve that goes through those points. And so that's what we're going to be doing with cosine. It's the same as working with sine, right? Whatever is being added or subtracted to cosine or sine is going to be added. A number in front is going to be a factor.